Dobar dan svima. Počet ćemo, iako se nismo još uvek baš svi okupili, ali da ne bismo mnogo kasnili, naročito zbog naše gošće i predavača. Ostalima ćemo dozvoliti da se uključe kasnije. Zahvaljujem vam se na početku što ste izdvojili vreme i interesovanje da budete deo ove današnje, nazvaćemo je radionice, predavanja, panela, bit će ono kako ga mi stvorimo, tako da praktično količine vaših pitanja, interaktivnosti i tako dalje, zavisi će koliko će ovo biti debatnog tipa, a koliko predavanje. Ja ću odmah preći na engleski, prosto iz poštovanja prema našoj gošći. So, Ifigenije, now we are back in English. First of all, on behalf of the Green Art Incubator team, I would like to thank you all once again for being here with us today, and especially thanks to Ifigenije for accepting our invitation to participate in this event and share her knowledge and her experiences with us. My name is Ksenija Marković-Božović. I'm research associate at the Faculty of Drama Arts and one of project co-founders. My colleagues and co-founders of the project are Jovana Karaulić, theater and film producer and assistant professor of theater production at the Faculty of Drama Arts, and Vladimir Đurđević, climatologist and professor at Faculty of Physics in Belgrade. With us today is also Tijana Mićanović, the coordinator of our project, and the wheel we need for complete functioning, and Vukashin, our technical support for all technical but all other questions as well. They will be at your disposal. The Green Art Incubator, sorry for my voice, I have flu and I sound like this. The Green Art Incubator project, as you have already read about, aims at educating and empowering organizations in the field of culture and arts toward ecological transformation, with an emphasis on internal change, considering organizational philosophy and sustainable work procedures. Today, the workshop is dedicated to the field of theater. And as a keynote speaker with us is Ifigenije Taksopulu. I'm very honored to present her to you. Ifigenije is a founding member and general secretary of the European Theatre Network Mythos 21, and an associate of Julie's Bicycle, which is the United Kingdom-based charity bridging environmental sustainability and the creative sector. She is artistic advisor, sustainability consultant, and lecturer. And as such, she has collaborated with numerous theaters, festivals, and cultural institutions in Europe. The wideness of her experience and her relevance in this field is proved with the fact that she is at this moment finishing a book about this topic that will be published by one of the by Bloomsbury as one of the most eminent publishers. Today, Ifigenije will introduce us to the organizational change and let's say key steps to embedding sustainability in theaters. The lecture will have two parts. After this first part of introduction, let's say, or some, let's say, general explanations of steps. We will have a Q&A session. You will be able to discuss with her and to ask about the things you are interested in. And then after that, we will continue her lecture with 3 very, very interesting case studies. So without further ado, Ifigenije, the Zoom floor is yours. And we are very, very happy to hear all things from you.
So hello from me. Hi, everybody. Thanks, Ksenia, for the introduction. And thank you all for inviting me today. I'm really pleased to join you. And I also want to congratulate the Green Art Incubator for taking the initiative to lead the sector in Serbia towards the green transition. And yeah, I'm very, very happy because as I was saying to the colleagues before, I've had very close connections to Serbia and Belgrade and Bitev and the theater there for many years, which unfortunately I haven't visited recently, but it's very dear to my heart. Yeah, and that makes it even more important for me to be here with you. So yes, I will first try to present to you the framework for change with a focus on the performing arts and theater, but also, as you will see, applicable to all cultural organizations, both on the practical steps, but also on the principles that define this sustainable transition for the cultural sector. And then I will show you 3 case studies, if we have the time, to see how this kind of sustainable transition really translates into action in real organizations. And I would kindly ask you, during the presentation, the first part, if you have any questions at any moment, just write them down so we have time to discuss them afterwards. So let me try to share the presentation. Can you see?
We can see.
Yeah, we can see
full screen.
Is that okay now?
Now it's full screen.
Great. Okay. So, sorry about that. So, framework for environmental change in culture organizations, obviously, and embedding sustainability. Just a couple of words about myself and my affiliations. So Mythos 21 is a European theatre network. I was one of the founding members back in 2008. And it brings together some theatre professionals and artists who are associated with big public theatres in Europe. You see the list of our members on the left side of the screen. It's not a very typical kind of professional network. It's more of a platform for collaboration. One of the strands of our activities has to do with sustainability, and therefore we have developed together with Julie's Bicycle in 2016 the Sustainable Culture Management course. So, and we have also a team, a sub-network of green managers. So we're trying to work in this direction as a network as well and embed sustainability among our membership. Of course, mainly today, I'm wearing my hat as Julie's Bicycle associate partner. Most of you perhaps know already Julie's Bicycle is a non-profit charity founded initially by the UK music industry in 2007. with the intention to bridge the arts and creative industries and environmental and climate issues. What we do is that we support culture to become net zero carbon and restore nature, to inspire public action on climate and ecology, and champion environmental justice and fairness. One main thing that we need to keep in mind is that environmental action is a process, it's a way of working, it's not an end destination. So it's not, we're not looking today or any other day to create a project that will somehow embed sustainability in a finite manner. It's just a way of changing our mindset and working in a different way. The two axes of the work is that on the one hand, we need to cut our impacts as a cultural sector and to use the cultural sector's power of communication in order to push for change. So Julie's Bicycle work on three main strands. One is organizational change through consultancy, certification, online, free online calculator specifically made for the culture sector, providing training and energy audits, mainly in the UK, of course. Then there is a strand of work in regards to sector transition. So there's lots of programs to support the sector in embedding sustainability, inspiring collaboration among the culture sector, pulling together a lot of research and data, resources, and organizing events. And the third strand, which is also very important, is policy. So cultural policy, city programs, and international advocacy on the policy level and how to support the sector in transitioning towards environmental sustainability. You may find a wealth of resources on the Julie's Bicycle website. They're all accessible for free. Guides, research, data, case studies. So I urge you to have a look when you have time and see how much we can really gain from your visit on the website. Just very quickly, I want to mention the Arts Council environmental program because it is a quite unique case of embedding environmental sustainability in the cultural policy of a country. So the Arts Council England, as you know, is the equivalent of a Ministry of Culture. Excuse me. Because the UK, they do not actually have a Ministry of Culture in the sense of many other countries. But the Arts Council partnered with Julie's Bicycle in 2012 and created a policy framework which actually made environmental sustainability a funding requirement for all the subsidized cultural organizations in England. Theaters, museums, dance companies, and so on and so forth. So it means that since 2012, all the national portfolio organizations, as they're called, need to report on their environmental progress. They need to have a policy in place, and they need to have an action plan. And then every year they need to report on how they have done in relation to the previous year. This has brought an enormous amount of change in the culture sector in the UK. And here that's from one of the latest reports. There is an annual report produced by the Arts Council and Julie's Bicycle. This is from the latest one just before COVID stroke, because of course you can imagine the disruption during COVID times. But some results that are worth looking at is, for instance, how organizations respond in surveys. So in terms of good governance, 66% of organizations report that they include environmental sustainability in core business strategies by now. 42% recognize environmental responsibilities in job roles, formally in job roles, and over 1/4 have an ethical sponsorship policy. In terms of operational practice, 70% have taken steps to eliminate single-use plastic, for instance. 54% have installed energy-efficient lighting and other such devices like, lighting sensors or timers. And 78% actively promote teleconferencing. And as regards engagement and collaboration, 51% have produced or have programmed work exploring environment. 30% have introduced collaborations with other cultural organizations to work together on environmental solutions. And already 13% are using a green rider when they are visiting or touring, for visiting companies or when touring their own productions. So you see, this is a very impressive image of change in the cultural sector in the UK in the last 10 years that the program has been in operation. Now, how this change has taken place. The Creative Green program, which has been supporting the culture sector, is based on two main premises. One is consultancy, so helping the sector, and the other is certification. So the Arts Council with Julie's Bicycle have come up with the Creative Green certification, which helps organizations track progress and communicate programs at the same time. So I would like to take you through this Creative Green framework for change. The main 4 steps are commit, understand, improve, and communicate. This is our framework for action. For example, this is the framework for museum change, for the environmental framework for museums. So as you see, this is how much it covers. You look into values and mission, you look into governance and management, commitment to action, then understanding impacts, internal communication and engagement inside the organization, that is, external communication and engagement, visitor or audience engagement, then looking at buildings and sites. For the museums, it's also collections and exhibitions, commercial services, but also finances, investment and fundraising, and then collaborations and partnership. And the process of embedding change starts from making initial progress, as you see below. Then for organizations that feel they are well on the way, then organizations feel that they are really incorporating best practice. And then you arrive at the point where an organization is actually not just embedding best practice, but leading the way and building anew on best practice. Now, to look at organizational change in more detail. Commit, what we mean by commit. Commitment means to develop a policy and action plans, embed sustainability in decision-making processes, create a green team, create, if possible, a designated budget, even if it's small, and engage everybody, the team, employees, artists, partners, audiences, suppliers, and stakeholders. The main idea behind commitment is to know what are the targets, what do you want to achieve and why. Then the next step is to measure and monitor impacts, have perhaps some carbon audits Many organizations do them inside themselves, internally. Other organizations prefer to consult with an expert. Surveys are very usual at the same time. Lots of organizations are surveying their audiences or their staff. So you get to understand exactly what are the issues around environmental impacts of your organization. This important part is, of course, to learn from others and build capacities for your team so that you are able to set priorities and realistic targets. Of course, then the third step is, once you understand where you stand, how you can improve, how you can translate these learnings into action, how you can achieve impact reduction. And then when you measure, when you have a baseline, then you are able to evaluate your performance against your targets and against your plans. And finally, equally importantly, the fourth step is to communicate. So talk about what you're doing, make it visible and inspiring so that you can activate people for action and the sector at the same time. So this is our framework for organizational change. These are the 4 steps. Now, environmental policy. It's basically the public statement of your organization in terms of its commitment and ambitions, and provides a unifying direction that will guide everybody's actions, the employees, the artists, the management, the stakeholders, audiences, and also suppliers. It's important to have an environmental policy because, on the one hand, it's a public statement and a commitment, and it helps the branding of your project. It enshrines good practice and supports decision-making in the organization. It's like a constitutional document. It helps you support any funding applications related to sustainability and environmental actions. It is also a tool for effective engagement. So staff, audiences, suppliers have a reference document on which to work towards sustainability. A policy also demonstrates relevance with perhaps national policy frameworks, and helps ensure public support for arts and culture. And finally, it helps maintain regulatory compliance, because regardless of whether different countries have different levels of environmental legislation, of climate change legal framework. So that helps the organization relate to a wider context. Now, what are the principles of a good policy? The policy has to be specific to the nature of your organization's activities and impacts. It has to be very important. It has to be supported and signed by the director or the top management. So it can be the artistic director or the board of directors. And it has to be developed with your team, the staff, audiences, and stakeholders. Do's and don'ts. As I said, make your policy specific to your organization instead of talking vaguely. Be clear about intentions and ambitions. So avoid making really wild, overambitious statements, because they will be demotivating later on. So for instance, you don't start by saying we will go carbon neutral or we will become a green organization, because these statements don't mean too much in a sense, and you cannot really account for them in the future. Say clearly why this policy matters to your organization. Don't assume that people just get it. You have to be clear in your communication. As I said, it's very important to get senior management support. You cannot progress very far without having the wider support inside the organization. And keep consulting with your team your audiences and stakeholders, and try not to cover too much. Try to take one step at a time. 6 steps to creating an environmental policy. First, scope your organization. Second, decide why sustainability is important to your organization. Decide which activities and impacts to focus on. Identify your environmental data and current activity. Prioritize on the most important impacts, and embed sustainability in your wider organization. So let's take a closer look. Scoping your organization means to think anew through the lens of environmental sustainability, what you do and where you do it. So do you have 1 building or 2 buildings? Are you a touring company? Are you a production company? So you need to reconsider the nature of your organization. Who comes to your events? What kind of types of travel and transports you use? Because it's different if it's a theater in the center of the city. It's different if it's an organization in the outskirts. If it's a festival, for instance, and outside of a city and people have to travel there. What type of goods and services and materials you use. So you need to reconsider the entire organization in light of your environmental sustainability project. Decide why sustainability is important. It might be different things, different priorities, but of course it might be all of that. So one point is business resilience. Another point is meeting funding requirements, because gradually there might be funding strands that require you to show environmental criteria. It might be that you want to enhance your reputation and engage stronger with audiences. It might simply be because it's the right thing to do. But you may also consider that it is a way of saving financial savings and managing costs. And of course, it's very important to consider that it is a way of audience outreach if you want to bring about positive environmental change. You will need to decide which activities to focus on. You will eventually need to focus on everything, but you will need to prioritize so it doesn't get overwhelming. So depending on the kind of your organization, you want to look at buildings, you want to look at productions, events, travel, procurement. For instance, as you will see later on Onassis Stegi in Athens, because their building is quite new, it was a quite energy sufficient building. So there wasn't too much work to do there. So what they decided was to focus very much on procurement and then to focus on productions. So each organization will have to judge, depending on the scoping exercises and the auditing processes, what to focus on by priority. And then once you decide the area, you need to also look which environmental impacts are the most important and which you can actually have control over. So is it energy? Is it waste? Is it procurement, travel, food and beverage, touring, etc.? One important area is to see what kind of environmental information data you have at hand, because not everything is a given. If you decide to use a professional auditor, then you will have a lot of help in this direction. But sometimes organizations don't have the financial possibility to do that, and you might want to try to do an internal evaluation. In any case, you need to find the source of information regarding all these impacts, and that's invoices, bills for energy, water, that provide a lot of useful information in terms of that. Now, in terms of recycling and waste, maybe you have an internal project already, recycling, so you can measure your waste and recycling rates. or you can ask your waste contractor if you have one, or it's quite easy to do it yourself by just following some basic guidelines regarding waste, which you can also find on the Julie's Bicycle website. Then business travel information. This is something that usually the supply department, operations department will be able to provide you with, or your travel agent. Audience travel information is difficult. Usually it's estimated, or you can run a survey. And then another important thing is whether you own the building where you are operating, or it's offices, or you leasing. So then you will have to collaborate with your landlord to get all the necessary data regarding the building, the figures of energy and water, and so on and so forth. Procurement is a very important area, which is usually not the first priority, but it's surprisingly important for the green transition. So that's basically what you buy, all the supplies, both for operations and for productions. And this is, if you have a production or an operations department, some organizations have a special department that are dealing with supplies. So this is a very important source of information. And finally, it's important to map past and current activities. Lots of organizations already are doing quite a lot in saving energy, for instance, in saving water, in recycling. So it is important to reevaluate what you have done so far and make it visible, and then reframe it under a more general environmental project. So don't be too harsh on yourselves, because it's very I've come across many times organizations that think they haven't done anything and they need to start from scratch. It's usually not true, because sometimes, even for financial reasons, organizations have very good policies in place. So you just need to reevaluate those and frame them inside a wider and more systematic approach. Of course, you need to prioritize on the most important impacts. So, for instance, one thing you need to consider is buildings and events that are connected to energy, water use, and waste. Then actual production, materials, energy use for productions, and waste again. Then procurement, as I said, which you will locate in catering, lots of different merchandise, marketing materials, printing. And then travel and transport. Business travel, that means who travels from staff, organization. Audience travel, then if the organization has trucks or cars, so vehicle fleet travel. And if you're touring or you are receiving touring companies, the transportation and production freight. And finally, you need to look at the wider process. So consider the wider context of your organization. It is not possible to work in a void and work completely separate from the wider context. Inside the organization, who will lead on the development, approval, and implementation? Is it the board? Is it the artistic director? Is it a team? Who holds and approves the required budget? Sometimes it might be outside the organization. It might be the Ministry of Culture. You might need to reconsider some allocation of funds if you want to work on a sustainability project. How will you monitor and review progress to see what isn't working? So you might need to set up like monthly meetings with a group of involved parties or stakeholders to be able to track progress. Sometimes you might find that somebody will be impacted from your policy. For example, if you decide to change your supplies. If you decide to look for a green supplier in terms of food and beverage, or your printing company, you need to consider that this might affect existing partnerships. So it's always good to consider whether you can influence the existing partnerships to also switch to environmental practices before abandoning people and finding new partners. And then how will you communicate your policy, your plans and programs, and to whom? Are you going to communicate only internally? And at what point will you start communicating to the public, to your audiences, and how will you do that? On what priority? Will you communicate to your stakeholders? Will you communicate to your sponsors, to the local community, to supervising authorities, and so on and so forth? Julie's Bicycle, as I said before, have created a certification scheme which is tailor-made for cultural organizations. So most of the organizations participate in the environmental program of the Arts Council take the Creative Green certification, which looks at all the different strands that I mentioned. So commitment, understanding, and improvement. This is an annual certification. Some organizations might choose to take it every 2 years to consider if you want to look for a certification scheme. Other organizations go for ISOs, which are a little bit more complicated, and for those it's mainly possible for bigger organizations, and you will need professional guidance for that. Others try the EMAS, the European certification for environmental management. Certification is basically a way to keep track of your progress. It's a way of having a little bit of a more professional approach. And it's also a very good communication tool, because you actually have all the information of where you are, how you started, the baseline, and your annual progress in one place. So it informs your policy, it informs your action plan, and it is, as I said, a very useful, important communication tool to share with your community, your staff, your artists, and your stakeholders. Now, this is the overview of what we mean by impacts. Environmental impacts can be found in 3 main areas of cultural organizations: operations, production and programming, and buildings. One important strand is energy and water. This you will locate in venues, offices, during rehearsals, on stage, and in connection to accommodation if you are hosting companies or if you are touring. Then another source of impacts is travel and transport of staff and artists, stage and set. Sometimes sets are built in warehouses that are away from the venues. So this is also set travel, but also it has to do with touring or inviting and presenting companies. Then production materials that are transported to the venue and travel of the audience. And then goods and services that are being supplied to the organization, which are also accounted for, but you don't have, an organization doesn't have transportation information. Then another source of impacts is procurement. That's all the supplies for offices, production materials, lots of different kinds of services, which can be catering, it can be cleaning services, and so on. Tickets, programs, marketing, merchandise, if you are producing any merchandise, and food and drink. And finally, waste. Waste is water, waste from operations, from production, from food and beverage, and the big problem of plastics. So this is an overview of what we mean by environmental impacts. It means that all these areas are measurable in carbon footprint. So if you make a carbon footprint estimate of your organization or any kind of other audit, this is the entire range of impacts that the auditor or you will be looking at. Now let's focus on people, because everybody has a role to play. On the one hand, the senior management and trustees, like the board of directors, these are the people who will basically put their stamp on the environmental policy and who will put their weight on supporting it. If you need to create budgets and resources for the greening project, it will have to have this approval. These are the people who will be working with policymakers and lobby for investments in renewable energy, public transport, and so on and so forth. So it's both those who hold together the project internally and those who are sharing the project externally. The area of operations. Operations is very important, of course, because it's the day-to-day energy and resource management. It's the people who will help with data collection, is the people who might be able to pilot new technologies and share learnings with each other inside and outside the organization. Production and design department. Of course, this is something that you might look at a later stage, because it's an area that is quite complicated to change in the theatre sector, but it very much has to do with a strong collaboration between the theatre team and artists, because it involves reducing material and waste, design in a different manner for reuse and disassembly, look how to reduce on new materials, source secondhand, repurpose existing sets and costumes, and so on and so forth. Another department that will play its part is marketing and communications, because they will have to work to change the marketing strategies. They will have to talk about the organization's environmental story, offer incentives and rewards, and be able to mobilize people inside the organization, celebrate successes, and then also share this with the culture sector and with external stakeholders. Creative programming, that's perhaps something that many organizations are already doing. It means to inform the creative program with environmental themes. Amplify voices, creating new relationships with other artists. So creative programming is a way of thinking about sustainability, talking about sustainability, not necessarily in the practical sense that the environmental policy and action plan involves, but in a more theoretical sense and more outward looking and more looking to engage the community. Sector, which is also standing between the organization and audiences, especially if you have a restaurant or a bar. So it's important to pass a message through what kind of food and beverage you are offering to the public. So we'll look at this later on in more detail. So every you in an organization has a role to play. Action plans. This is an example of an action plan, which is basically, this is from Lyric Hammersmith. So it's good after you have mapped your entire organization's impacts and the priorities, then it's really important to have an action plan where you have the objectives, you have the actions that need to be taken, you have a timeline, whose responsibility it is, if you have any performance indicators, and then the relevant budget. So let's take green or cleaning products, for instance. What you need to do, you have to change purchasing according to new criteria where possible, establish a list of preferred and banned cleaning products and materials, and so on and so forth. Timeline, you have to do that between April and June 2016. Who is responsible? The office manager with support from the cleaning contractor. And what is a performance indicator? Here, it's the percentage of cleaning products and packaging in line with policy. So if you start, for instance, with 100% non-environmental products, you want to achieve 50% environmentally friendly products by June 2022, as an example. And here, the action plan also includes public and staff engagement. So it's not just actions that have to do with impacts, but it's also actions that have to do with social impacts. So what to do to engage regularly your staff, your artists, your team members, and your audiences and the wider community. Now, the principles. I wanted to briefly walk you through the principles, because of course there is for each organization the plan will have to be different, but the principles of sustainability are the same. So one thing is to prioritize what you can control. There is a control area, so the things that you have complete control over. For instance, if you want and can switch to a renewable energy contractor, this is up to you. Then there is an area where you can only exercise influence. So how your audiences travel, it's not up to you. So you really just need to communicate the best practice and influence them. And then there is an area that you cannot control. So if you are situated very far away from public transport, then you cannot do anything to change that except for try to influence the public authorities, but you cannot actually invest in, making a bus line. The best hierarchy, that goes for every area of impact. First, you need to measure, then you need to identify what you can avoid, then how much you can reduce. That means how efficient you can get, what you can replace. For example, you may be able to replace chemical paints in a workshop with plant-based paints. And then when you cannot replace, when you have done everything in your power to reduce your impacts, then the final solution is offsetting. The backbone of a project, as I said, is data. You need to measure and understand where you stand, measure and monitor your impacts, run surveys and audits. And so you see where you can actually really make a difference. And you always have a possibility to know that you work in the context of the big picture. Identify priorities, identify opportunities for reducing impacts, setting targets and tracking progress. And after that comes communication, engagement, and awareness raising. Useful terminology, because there is a lot of jargon, environmental jargon going around. So if you hear science-based targets, it means that you set targets that are developed in line with decarbonization required to keep global temperature increase below 2 degrees Celsius. So that these are international standards. Net zero means that greenhouse gas emissions are reduced to a minimum and remaining emissions are offset or sequestered. And the ultimate aim is climate positive. So that means that beyond achieving net zero carbon emissions, you as an organization, but basically society as a whole, ends up in a state where it is possible to remove additional emissions from the atmosphere. Another set of jargon that you will come across is scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. This refers to your control zones. So scope 1 is emissions, is the impacts that you produce inside the organization from your own operations. Scope 2 are the emissions which are produced outside the organization. So the electricity you are buying and consuming is carrying an environmental impact that is beyond the scope of the organization. And scope 3 is all the other emissions that are indirect, from products, from services, from outside transportation. I'm not going to go into details, but I'm happy to discuss further if you wish. So briefly, the zero carbon pathway means use energy as efficiently as possible, electrify buildings, switching, for instance, from gas to heat pumps, and use green electricity, either on-site or locally procured. Net zero carbon culture is less energy and zero carbon energy sources for culture buildings and events. A circular creative economy, replacing the take, make, dispose model, sustainable and zero carbon travel and transport, less meat and dairy, protecting and enhancing nature and biodiversity, divesting from fossil fuels, a new creative ecology, so green and sustainable products, collaboration and partnerships to find better environmental solutions, engaging audiences and visitors and inspiring action, and finally, working with local and regional policymakers to support net zero plans. This is the entire framework. Focus briefly on waste. It means that you need to consider at the start what will happen at the end. So moving from linear economy to circular economy. The hierarchy for material use and waste is that you need to reduce, reuse, recycle, recover, because there is a possibility to recover energy from materials, and at the very, very last, as a very, very last solution, dispose in landfill. Reducing travel and transport has also its own hierarchy. Likewise, you need to measure the activity in question. You try to avoid emissions by doing things differently, for example, Skype or other teleconferencing platforms. Reduce emissions, replace, and again, offset. I won't dwell on this, but I'm happy to discuss afterwards, because offsetting is a big discussion, and you will be able to look at it quietly afterwards when you get the presentation. But basically, just to perhaps you already know, but offsetting is a practice by which you compensate for the emissions that you cannot reduce by investing a certain amount of money in sustainability projects. So there is a way of putting a price on the emissions that you are producing and you cannot reduce, and to invest this amount in a number of projects that are producing positive environmental impacts in your area or in different places around the world. That's the general concept. Very quickly to look into production. So when we're looking at sustainability for stage productions, you look into sets, props, and costumes. So where are your materials being sourced? Can you reuse and recycle existing materials? Do you have any sustainable alternatives? And then how can you construct sets so that they're easily recycled? What happens, what happens to the sets and props and costumes after the show? Can you actually afterwards separate and reuse materials? In terms of procurement and sourcing, what you need to consider is ethics, where they come from. Are they traveling a big distance? Who manufactures them? Can you use responsibly sourced products and materials? Can you source locally? Can you hire instead of purchasing? And can you design for efficiency and be flexible? Sourcing means, for example, responsibly sourced products and materials have to do with recycled metal and timber where possible, certified wood, avoiding plastics and PVC materials, fabrics that are easily reused or recycled. Try not to use toxic elements in paints and other treatments. Try to use organic and environmentally friendly and certified stage textiles. And for construction, for example, use nails and glue sparingly. Try to use screws because that means that you can disassemble sets more easily. So construct to enable material separation. And if going on tour, try to construct as possible, as flexible as possible so that it packs down and it's light and easy to transport. Another area to look at is greening the office. So the office is an area where people spend a lot of time, and this is also a source of mind shift for employees. So you have to look at energy, heating, cooling, lighting, but also the office equipment, the kitchen equipment, water consumption, where the waste goes, the paper use, procurement for the office, but also travel for people who go to the office. And part of a sustainability project is better future planning in all respects, because that saves money and it also saves on emissions. Focus on plastic. So that's a big area. Many organizations who are running environmental sustainability projects have done specific campaigns for plastics. And here I'm showing you the plastic-free lyric campaign, which won the award for the best environmental campaign a few years ago, focusing on use of plastic and running a campaign to mobilize staff, artists, and audiences in reducing plastic use and actually eventually banning single plastics from cultural organizations. So all in all, what we have found, organizations who embed sustainability are getting ahead of regulation. So if you make changes now, this prepares you better for new regulation in the future. It saves time and saves money in the long term. It's also, of course, important that it's environmentally positive. It reduces impacts and produces financial savings. Carbon is linked to energy use, travel and waste production and disposal, and reducing the carbon footprint of your operations will help save money on energy, on waste and travel bills, and of course, make the entire organization more environmentally friendly. It helps better reputations and community outreach. Sustainability, as we all know, has become a priority for audiences and consumers across all sectors. So there are value-based demands for more ethical, environmentally responsible choices. And finally, of course, it's social and artistic commitment. Cultural organizations as social organizations, as well as artistic ones, should be at the heart of the big challenges of our time, which is the climate and environmental crisis. So I'm going to stop the share here before we go into the case studies. And perhaps, Ksenia, we could ask the colleagues if they have any sort of questions.
Yes, of course. Tiana will moderate this Q&A session. So please, if anyone has any question, but I would like to use my position to ask the first question. I have a billion, but I will choose the one because it seems interesting. You mentioned this term offsetting, and as a term which means to, let's say, pay for emissions we have to produce. So I would like to just, if you can highlight the difference, because of course there are differences, but to highlight differences between offsetting and greenwashing, because it seems to me that this greenwashing phenomenon, let's say, is more and more let's say popular, especially in not just in Serbian society, but even wider global society.
Yeah, so very good question. Greenwashing takes many forms. So one form of greenwashing is to say, for instance, we are going carbon neutral, whereas you don't have the policy in place to do that. So anything that is not being supported by real action and by measurable results and by honesty and transparency is basically near or in the heart of greenwashing. The second form of greenwashing is for corporate companies, to use culture to pretend that they are open to thematic events around environmental issues that makes them engaged with environmental sustainability. That's another form of greenwashing. But when it comes to offsetting, this is perhaps the most crucial area, and I'm very hesitant to go to suggest offsetting to culture organizations for many reasons. One is that offsetting usually refers to those organizations that have the financial means to invest in offsetting projects. And as we know, most culture organizations are not in a position to do that. The worst case of offsetting is when companies are not doing the best first to reduce their impacts, but instead they are paying off, let's say, by paying for their carbon emissions on projects that can be environmentally ethical or not, just to present themselves as being environmentally conscious and sustainable. So the main prerequisite for offsetting is that you have done absolutely everything in your power to cut your emissions, to reduce your emissions, to change the ethical framework of your organization. And then after you have done everything in your power, then you can offset the remaining emissions. Anything before is more like pushing the ball to another field. the second form of greenwashing is if where do you invest? Because then there is an abundance of projects which might not be so ethical, might be connected to fossil fuels, for instance, and you don't know it. So when actually somebody needs to invest on offsetting projects, then there is a lot of greenwashing going around as well. So one needs to be very, very careful and do a proper research to find the projects that are really paying off and are really investing in environmental projects across the world on the basis of the most important priorities. So greenwashing has, as you said, it takes many shapes, and offsetting is definitely one slippery ground for that. I don't know if I answered.
Yes, perfect. Sorry. Yes, thank you for your explanation. That's perfectly clear. Actually, offsetting is coming when you have already tried everything and done everything, and then you are in the great position to be able to offset something. And greenwashing is something completely different. And yes, it's greenwash. If I can just add, has one more for us, for the theater, difficult aspect, and that is the way that theater becomes the way, or some theatrical project becomes the way for greenwashing of someone else. For example,
Exactly.
Industry or whatever, whomever. So yes.
For instance, if an oil company sponsors a theater company to do an environmental production or an environmental project, for me, this is greenwashing, because unless this company is really working so hard on reducing its impacts and changing its practices and so on and so forth. So you need to have a very transparent and very solid, holistic approach before you begin calling yourself environmentally conscious or green or whatever. So it's always better to be a little humble and make sure that when you have a story to tell, it's a story that is grounded on real information, on real data, on real efforts. So you really convey also the challenges and the problems. It's much better to be honest about what you are not able to do and how you're trying to get better, rather than just advertise all the fantastic results and successes of a greening project.
Thank you, Ifigenije, a lot for this explanation and answer. So do we have more questions?
Okay, well, then maybe I can ask the next question and wait for the other ones from the audience. So you stated that, of course, every organization needs to set their own targets. Of course, and that is the first step, to commit and to assess their options and possibilities. But maybe what would you say, what would you recommend to be the first step? What is the easiest way? Where is that position, the easiest one to start? What to focus on for the beginning?
As I said, it differs because it depends on the organization. So I know that for bigger institutions, the big fear is the building. Everybody worries very much about how expensive and how complicated it will be to start by greening their buildings. And it's true to some extent, but for me, the most important thing is to have a team that is engaged in starting the project. And then to look at the various dimensions. So look at the building, look at the production, look at the procurement, first you need to understand what the entire scope of the possible interventions are, and then start with the small steps. So for instance, the building, which is always a big challenge, before changing all the windows, before insulating all the walls, because this, of course, it's an investment. There is so much one can do in everyday operations of a building to reduce impacts and save money at the same time without spending a penny. That it's quite surprising. I can tell you from experience, just by reconsidering operational models, just by looking at what lights are on where, just by, as we say, delamping. So, you know, we'll have these square lights over the offices with 4 or 5 light bulbs. Just by unscrewing 2 of those, research shows that by just simple measures of better management, if you wish, you can reduce impacts and costs during office hours by almost 15%. So I advise colleagues to start. The most important thing is to start. It looks like a mountain, but it's basically a valley with hills. There are bumps to overcome. There are difficulties, but you need to look at the difficulties from a closer distance to really understand that they are not unsurmountable. I'm very well aware that when you present a framework like that, it looks like a very complicated venture. But once you start, then you realize, first of all, it's a process. So you start by taking the first step, and then the first step brings knowledge, expertise, and desire to take the second step. And I find that what happens in organizations is that it's an internal mind shift that then moves the project much faster than one can imagine.